I will not tolerate this insolence. Heads will roll for this incompetence.
No one dared speak above a whisper in the cold corridors of Whitehall Palace during the final days of January in the year 1547. The winter wind howled through stone cracks and heavy windows. But it wasn't the cold that chilled the servants. It was the smell, a sickly sweet stench of human rot, soaked in musk, myrrh, pine resin, and frankincense. The most expensive fragrances the royal household could burn to mask the unspeakable truth. The king was decaying, and, not metaphorically, Henry VIII was rotting while still alive. This was no deathbed fit for a God-anointed monarch. It was a chamber of horror. The once mighty king, who had severed England from Rome, executed 2 wives, rewritten religious law, and ruled by divine terror, now lay bloated and helpless, trapped inside a body that had betrayed him. Gasping in the dark, he weighed nearly 400 pounds, his legs ulcerated to the bone, his flesh yellow and splitting when he shifted, and blood and pus spilled onto the silk sheets. Attendants gagged, some vomiting into their sleeves, others fleeing the room. The air inside was unbearable. Yet no one dared say the words out loud. The king was dying like a common beast, rotting from the inside out. And the worst part, he knew it. Henry screamed in the night, clawing at the bedposts, mumbling names no one wished to hear. Anne Boleyn, Thomas More, Cromwell. Ghosts of the executed seemed to crawl from the corners of the room, summoned by a dying mind, tormented by its own cruelty. He wept for forgiveness in his sleep. He barked orders in delirium. On some days, he called for Catholic rituals. The next day, he demanded Protestant scripture. The king who had torn England in 2 for his personal desires could no longer remember which God he was supposed to serve. But even as his sanity unraveled, his grip on power remained. His trembling hand, swollen and purple, still signed death warrants. The Duke of Norfolk, a loyal servant for decades, was condemned to die just hours before Henry took his final breath. Even as his lungs collapsed, Henry's shadow reached beyond the grave. The royal physicians, terrified of failure, tried everything: bloodletting, crushed pearls, ground human skull, pigeons sliced in half and laid across his wounds, onions, opium, gold dust, embalming herbs stuffed into open sores. They knew nothing would work, but they feared being accused of regicide more than they feared death itself. So they kept cutting, kept praying, kept pretending. No one wanted to be the one who told the king that his body could no longer be saved, that the stink of decay wasn't from a poor soul in the dungeon below, but from their own sovereign, outside that death chamber. Another kind of war brewed, a silent, ruthless battle for the boy. Edward, Henry's 9-year-old son, the frail child born of Jane Seymour, waited in the shadows of the court, a pawn in the hands of men who wanted the throne behind the throne. His uncle Edward Seymour moved swiftly, eliminating rivals, locking up Catholics, forging alliances, all while the king still gasped in his sheets. Everyone knew the king's breath would stop, and England would be up for grabs. Whoever claimed the boy claimed the crown. So they waited, plotted, smiled, bowed, and then it came. In the dead of night, sometime between January the 27th and 28th, the breath stopped. The room fell silent. A hand was squeezed once to confirm faith in Christ. Then nothing. The Lion of England was dead. But death was only the beginning. The corpse, bloated and infected, began to decompose at terrifying speed. The embalmers panicked. They removed organs, stuffed the hollowed body with herbs, sealed it in a lead-lined coffin. But it wasn't enough. The gases swelled. The pressure built. And before the journey to Windsor, the coffin split. Fluid leaked. The floor of the chapel was stained. Dogs licked the seepage before anyone could stop them. It was a grotesque final insult to a man obsessed with control and legacy. Yet outside, the lie continued. The public saw a grand funeral. Black-draped horses, trumpets, and solemn hymns. A wax effigy of the king slim, proud, regal, placed atop the coffin to fool the people into believing their king had died as he had lived, powerful, untouchable, magnificent. No one outside the palace would know that the real body beneath the wax was dissolving into a pool of bile and shame. Henry's image, painted by Hans Holbein as a wide-legged, broad-shouldered Titan, survived. That portrait would become England's memory of him. Not the gurgling corpse. Not the bursting coffin. Not the mad whispers. Not the dogs. This was how the story ended. But in the episodes to come, we will walk into the sick room. Hour by hour. We will smell what they smelled. Hear what they heard. Witness the collapse not only of a man, but of a myth. You will learn what his skin felt like, what he feared in the dark, what he left behind in the locked chest beside his bed. You will see how power melts, how legacy lies, how even a king cannot outrun the stench of death. Because the terrifying truth is this: Henry VIII did not die like a king. He died like a secret that no one could clean up. It began, as most tragedy do, not with a scream, but with silence. A silence so heavy it clung to the walls of Whitehall Palace like mildew. The courtiers knew not to speak of it, though the signs had already begun to show long before the final winter. They had watched his stride slow from a proud stomp to a limp. They had watched the tapestries near his bed be replaced, not for beauty, but to mask the smell. They had seen him shift from armor to armchairs, from jousting fields to mechanical lifts, from lion to something less, something trapped. By the year 1547, Henry VIII was no longer a man. He was a wound that breathed. His body was no longer flesh, but a rotting monument to power and punishment, a slow-motion collapse that no crown could hide. His legs, once muscled from tournaments and battle, VIII, ulcerated stumps, the skin stretched tight over infection, split and weeping, a mix of blood and yellow pus that soaked through linen, velvet, and pride alike. Courtiers gagged behind silk gloves. Candles burned day and night beside his bed, not for prayer, but to mask the reek. Sometimes it worked. Often, it did not. He could not walk. Not truly. His bulk had grown to such proportions that even rising from the mattress required a hoist, a contraption of iron and pulleys designed to lift livestock, not kings. The king had become his own cage, and each movement triggered spasms of agony. He groaned, cursed, wailed. Sometimes he thrashed so violently that attendants were thrown back. Other times he lay so still that they placed mirrors to his mouth. Unsure if he was breathing, there were days when blood seeped from his legs faster than they could wrap them. Bandages were changed hourly. Nothing held. Nothing healed. His skin, once admired for its golden glow, had turned sickly. Jaundice, like parchment left to rot in a damp cellar. His fingers were swollen. The nails blackened. His mouth, once used to charm queens and issue death warrants, now stank of decay. His teeth loosened one by one until the king could barely chew, and meals were ground into paste and spoon-fed with trembling hands. Every function of his body had betrayed him. Even his bowels, what once had been private now, required teams of servants working in grim silence, cleaning, lifting, wiping, apologizing to a man who had once commanded empires with a glance. And the pain, it was constant, crushing, crowling, the kind that made men scream for death. His physicians tried to help. In the way 16th century medicine understood help, they lanced the ulcers with iron. They smeared poultices made from onion, honey, wine, and animal fat. They applied pigeon halves, pressed against his wounds in the hope of drawing out the poison. Some went further, resorting to the dark arts of alchemical experimentation, powdered gems, boiled herbs, liquefied gold. One even sprinkled ground-up human bone over the king's sores, believing the life force of the dead might revive the dying. Nothing worked. Or worse, what did numb the pain also stole the king's mind. Opium was the only relief. It came in vials and tinctures, thick and bitter, dropped under the tongue or rubbed into the skin, and with it came fog. The king drifted in and out of lucidity. One moment he barked orders, threatening execution to those who dared speak of his illness. The next, he murmured like a child, speaking to his dead brother, or his mother, or some angel that no one else could see. He spoke in circles. He asked where Anne was, even though she had been dead for more than a decade. He mistook his chaplain for Cromwell and tried to strangle him. The mind unraveled with the body. Yet still, no one dared say the word dying. Not aloud. Not within the tapestried walls of that chamber, where reality was draped in velvet and denial hung thicker than incense. Physicians reported progress. Advisors whispered of recovery. Royal proclamations described the king as vigorous and reflective. Even as his body leaked through his mattress, the truth was locked inside the bedchamber, guarded by oaths and fear. For to announce the death of a king before he had truly gone was treason. And so the lie continued. While the body underneath crumbled, those closest to him began to treat his flesh with the reverence of a sacred relic. Not because they loved him, most had long ago learned not to, but because his body, however broken, still carried the weight of law. He could still sign an execution order. He could still change the succession. He could still destroy reputations with a grunt or a glance. Even as he wasted, he ruled. The paradox of monarchy in its purest form, and yet, within that same paradox lay something else. Something fragile. A kind of sadness that no historian's chronicle quite dares to name. There were moments brief, and flickering moments when Henry seemed to understand what he had become. He would ask if the room smelled odd. He would lift the covers and look at his own legs and turn away. Eyes wide, lips trembling. He would weep, quietly, bitterly, alone as attendants stood motionless at the foot of his bed, pretending not to see. This was not the death of a tyrant in glory, nor of a hero in battle. This was the slow unraveling of a man trapped inside a body that had become a prison. A warning. A mirror. For all his sins. For all his violence. For all his boasts and proclamations and wives and wars. In those final days, Henry was just flesh. Foul-smelling. Agonized. Oozing. Crumbling flesh. And in that, perhaps, there was something human, something tragic, something true. He had reshaped the country. He had torn it from the Pope, beheaded queens, dissolved monasteries, filled dungeons with bones. He had made himself the sun around which England revolved. But in the end, that sun dimmed, not with a shout, but with a wheeze, with a wound, with a body that no longer obeyed. The king was not dead yet, but he was dying, visibly, horribly, irreversibly. And still, no one dared speak it aloud. There are moments in a man's final days when the body's collapse becomes almost secondary to the deeper, quieter ruin happening behind the eyes. And for Henry VIII, that ruin arrived, not as a violent burst, but as a slow unraveling. A gentle peeling back of the mind until what remained was less a king and more a restless spirit trapped in a decaying shell. Those who entered his chamber in the dim hours before dawn reported that they no longer recognized him. Not because of the swelling or the colorless skin or the way his breath rattled in his throat, but because of the way he stared into corners where no one stood, and listened to voices no one else heard, and answered questions no one had asked. It was as if the ghosts of his reign had decided to gather around his bed, summoned not by magic, but by memory, returning to collect debts long overdue. He spoke to them in fragments, never in full sentences, his words drifting like smoke. Some nights he whispered Anne Boleyn's name with a softness he had never shown her in life, as though he mistook her for a companion rather than a woman he had destroyed. Other nights he growled out the syllables of Thomas More, his voice trembling not with anger, but with something close to shame. And then there were the darker moments, when he screamed for Cromwell or Surrey or any of the men whose heads had fallen because he had nodded once in irritation. The attendants did not understand the language of nightmares, but they understood the terror in his voice, the sudden gasps, the thrashing beneath the silks, the desperate clawing at the canopy as though he were trying to climb away from something crawling up from the foot of the bed. There were nights when they swore they felt the temperature drop, when even the candles sputtered as if unwilling to stay lit in the presence of whatever Henry thought he saw. He drifted between worlds not yet dead, no longer fully alive, hovering in that thin, dangerous space where reality and delirium blurred. Physicians blamed the opium, the infection, the fever, the lack of sleep. Priests blamed the weight of sin pressing against a conscience finally too weak to resist. Politicians blamed nothing. They simply waited, eyes downcast, careful never to meet the king's gaze in case he saw in them another ghost. But whatever the cause, the effect was unmistakable. Henry was losing his mind, and he knew it. There were rare lucid hours when he forced himself upright, demanded scriptures, argued theology, reaffirmed doctrines he had spent decades shaping with blood and fire. Yet even then his confidence faltered. One day, he recited Catholic prayers with trembling conviction, insisting on ritual and sacrament as if reaching backward toward the faith of his childhood. The next day he declared Protestant certainty, proclaiming his break from Rome with the same fever that had once made him a hero to reformers. It was as if the king who had once crafted a church in his own image now stood lost between two altars, unable to decide which God was still willing to claim him. Those caring for him watched this spiritual pendulum swing and said nothing. They bowed. They nodded. They murmured assurances. But in truth, they were terrified, for a king whose word was still law, even in delirium, could condemn them all with a single mistaken thought. And so they kept the chamber quiet, the candles burning low, the windows shuttered, the whispers soft. They tried to protect him from his own mind, though they knew the battle was unwinnable. Madness and memory are stubborn enemies. They do not retreat simply because a crown demands it. In the quieter stretches of the night, When the pain eased enough to let the opium pull him downward, Henry seemed to sink into the past. He spoke of jousts, long finished, of hunting trips, of the days when he had been young and golden and adored. He called for his mother in a voice so small that the attendants who heard it looked away. Ashamed to witness such naked longing, he asked after Jane Seymour with a sorrow that broke through the thick crust of arrogance that had defined him for decades. He spoke of his son, Edward, with pride, but also with fear. Fear that the boy was too gentle, too frail, too pure for the weight of a kingdom built on violence. Sometimes he wept at the thought of Elizabeth, the daughter who carried her mother's eyes, the child whose birth had cost him the sanity of a nation, and Mary stern. Devout Mary. He whispered her name, as though unsure whether to ask forgiveness or grant it. But always, inevitably, the ghosts returned. They stood at the edge of his vision, silent judges. Henry would stare at them with a vacant dread, as though he recognized each face but could not remember how to ask for mercy. The attendants, following their training, never turned to look, never followed his gaze, never acknowledged the shadows gathering in the corners. To see what the king saw would be to invite madness into their own minds. It was enough to hear the tremor in his breath, the choking gasp, the whispered apologies. As the nights grew longer and the winter deepened, the boundaries of his reality thinned even further. Time unraveled. Conversations looped back on themselves. He repeated the same questions again and again. What day is it? Who stands there? Why is the room so dark? Until even the answers became meaningless rituals. He lost track of morning and night. His attendants kept the candles lit so constantly that no one could tell when dawn broke. And Henry drifted deeper into the only world that still felt real, the world behind his eyelids, where the living and the dead shared the same space. It was in those final days that something remarkable happened, something no official record will ever capture. Because it was too quiet, too fragile, too human, Henry began to fear death, not as a punishment, but as a truth. He had built his kingdom on fear. But now fear belonged to him. He clutched the sheets like a child afraid of the dark. He begged his chaplain to stay near. He asked if God still listened, and in a whisper that seemed to tear through the silence, he asked if anyone could stop the dreams. No answer came, because there are questions for which even kings receive no reply. And as Henry's body weakened, his mind continued to wander into the shadows, chasing voices no one else could hear, waiting for a dawn he was no longer certain he would live to see. There are some deaths that begin in the body, and some that begin in the mind. With Henry VIII, they arrived together, marching like twin armies toward a throne, no longer capable of resisting them. By the time his legs oozed infection and his breath came in huffs of sour air, his mind had already begun to tear itself apart, thread by thread. He did not go mad all at once. That would have been merciful. Instead, he unraveled by degrees, like a great tapestry left too long in damp and silence, fraying from the edges inward, while everyone around him pretended not to see the threads fall. At first, it was confusion, names forgotten, orders repeated. He asked for dishes that had not been served in years, requested music from long-dead composers, and demanded audiences with men who had already met the axe by his own command. Then came the suspicion. He accused his grooms of theft, his cooks of poisoning, his guards of plotting. He trusted no one, and yet could not bear to be alone. When night fell, he demanded candles be kept lit until dawn, and that priests and physicians remain within calling distance. But the light did not protect him from the dark. Nothing did. He began to see them, They came in the hours between sleep and waking the seasons. In the moments when opium blurred the lines between memory and hallucination. Anne Boleyn appeared first, not as she had been when she captivated Europe, but as she had looked when they led her to the scaffold, pale, still, her eyes fixed on him with no expression. Then came Thomas More, silent and bloodless. Holding nothing but the law, he had refused to betray. Cromwell followed, with hands that had once built empires now clasped as if in prayer. And others, too many to name. Men and women whose lives had ended with Henry's signature on the page. They stood at the foot of his bed. And they did not speak. They watched. He begged them to go. He wept. He screamed. He whispered apologies and curses. At times he tried to strike them, thrashing wildly at empty air, while his servants held him down. Other nights he fell into quiet conversation with them, speaking of things no one else could understand. He asked them if they remembered the days when he had believed himself invincible. He asked if they had forgiven him. He asked in the faintest of tones if God had. His faith, once a tool of statecraft, became a storm. He had broken from Rome to seize power, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and filled the realm with blood and fire in defense of his truth. But now, that truth betrayed him. He demanded Mass in Latin one morning, and raged against papal corruption by dusk. He ordered Protestant sermons, and then tore them up. He kissed crucifixes and cursed reformers. No one could predict which God he served on any given day, and perhaps neither could he. His soul was at war with itself, and there were no victors left to crown. The priests who attended him wrote of nightmares so violent that they feared for their own lives. He would wake shrieking, soaked in sweat, clawing at his chest as if something inside him were trying to escape. He once cried out that fire was spreading through his veins. Another time, he claimed to hear his mother calling him from the river. The Archbishop of Canterbury recorded one evening in which Henry sat upright and asked if the dead had begun to sing. No one answered. Yet, amidst all this madness, he clung to one thing with clarity control. He reviewed his will obsessively. Every clause, every name, every title. It had grown to 30 pages of obsession, paranoia, and precise demands. He rearranged the line of succession in whispers and fury. First, Edward Planks, then Mary, then Elizabeth. He made it law that his children should rule in turn, regardless of their mother's disgrace or the church's disapproval. Even as his flesh fell away, and his thoughts slipped like mist through his fingers, Henry remained determined to rule from beyond the grave. But in the corridors of Whitehall, the whispers grew bolder. The king was not the man he had been. The throne was trembling, and those who had once feared his voice now feared the silence left in its place. Part 4. The War for the Boy Succession in the Shadows. While the king screamed in his fevered bed, another silence gathered in the stone corridors just outside his chamber. It was a silence, thick with ink and knives, a silence of glances exchanged behind closed doors, and steps muffled on rush-strewn floors. No one dared speak it aloud, but they all knew Henry was not going to recover. And when he died, the crown would not go to a warrior, or a council, or a queen. It would go to a child, a boy of 9, a boy whose lungs were still fragile, whose hands trembled when he held a pen, whose eyes had not yet seen war, but whose name would be etched into the history of a fragile kingdom. His name was Edward, and he was the key to everything. Edward Seymour, the boy's uncle, had waited years for this moment. A man of calculation and cold ambition, Seymour understood better than anyone that true power did not sit on the throne, it stood beside it. He moved like a ghost through the dying king's court. His face a mask of mourning. His hands always folded. His voice low. But behind the mask, wheels turned. Letters were written. Alliances formed. Keys were copied. Men sworn to other loyalties began to look toward him, as if sensing the direction of the coming wind. The Duke of Norfolk, once Henry's most trusted Catholic noble, now sat imprisoned in the Tower, awaiting an execution that the king had ordered from his sickbed. Norfolk's son, Henry Howard, was already dead, condemned for dreaming too loudly of royal blood. The Catholic faction, Onze Dominant, had been gutted in a single stroke. The Protestant reformers, led by Seymour, rose like mist after a storm. They knew they had to move quickly, for even as Henry's mind wandered, he still signed orders, still cursed enemies, still clung to the illusion that his word carried weight. The illusion had to be preserved for a little while longer. Every visitor to the royal chamber was watched. Every letter that left the palace was scrutinized. Catherine Parr, the Queen, was kept at a distance. Even she, the sixth wife, who had outlived all others, was no longer permitted full access to the dying man. The council gathered in hushed circles. The will was locked. Seals were prepared. The lie continued. Then came the stroke. On the 27th of January, the king seized. His body convulsed so violently that his attendants feared he might snap the bedposts in half. When it passed, his right side lay limp, his mouth slack, his words slurred beyond recognition. The physicians knew the end had begun. Still, the truth was kept hidden. For if word reached the city that the king was dying, factions might rise, nobles might act, foreign powers might invade. The corpse of a monarch was a beacon to vultures, and England was not ready to feed them, and so the court played its last, silent game. The king lay dying, muttering fragments of dreams and judgments, barely able to breathe. And just outside the door, the men who would rule in his son's name sharpened their knives not for battle, but for inheritance. The body of Henry VIII had become a battlefield of flesh, but the soul of England was already being divided behind his back. They tried to preserve him. They tried everything, but no silk or silver, no priest or physician, no law or lineage could contain what he had become. In the long hours after Henry VIII took his final breath, Whitehall Palace became a tomb with no doors. The men in power moved quickly, not to mourn, not to comfort the widow or bless the heir, but to hide, to control, to wrap the truth in ritual before it leaked through the floor. The king had died just before dawn on the 28th of January. In the year 1547, his last gesture, it was said, was a squeeze of the hand to the Archbishop of Canterbury, a wordless sign that he died in faith. What kind of faith? No one could say. His mouth could no longer form doctrine. His eyes, which had once terrified lords into silence, had grown filmy and soft, like wax before it melts. By the time the sun rose, his chamber had been sealed to all but the most essential men, and a grim race had begun not to announce his death, but to conceal it. For 3 full days, England was ruled by a ghost. Inside the palace, the doctors sweated and whispered. The body was already swelling. The heat from the bed had fed the rot. The ulcers on his legs had opened wider in death, revealing layers of dead muscle and sour flesh that smelled of iron and damp earth. Beneath the skin, gas was building, the kind of gas that made coffins creak and nails bend. the kind of gas that made dogs whimper at locked doors. The embalmers were summoned immediately. They opened him. They removed what they could. The liver was black. The heart, bloated and strangely shaped. The intestines, no one wanted to look too long. They filled the empty spaces with herbs, with spices, with cloth soaked in wine and oil. But it was too late. The coffin was sealed with lead, lined and nailed and blessed. It was reinforced to bear the weight of a king whose frame had once cast a shadow like a statue. His girth was such that the coffin had to be built nearly twice the width of a noble's, and even then, it bulged. The bier that carried him groaned under his mass, and servants were chosen not for loyalty, but for strength. Every window in the chamber was thrown open to the January air. But the smell remained. They doused the bed with vinegar. They burned pine resin. Still, it lingered. On the fourth night, the coffin cracked. No thunder announced it. No trumpet. Just a sound. A soft, wet pop. A seam giving way. A stream of dark fluid trickling from beneath the lead-lined lid. It ran like ink across the floor. The guards saw it first. A thin black line glistening in candlelight. Then the dogs, Henry's own hounds, once fed by royal hand, crept forward and began to lick. The chapel was silent. What happened next was never written in any official chronicle. But letters, rumors, and the accounts of servants told the story for centuries afterward, that the dogs lapped at the king's remains, that the chapel reeked of death, that the cracked coffin was patched in haste, sealed again with wax and prayer, and linen soaked in balm, that the floorboards were scrubbed with sand and lime, that those who witnessed it were sworn to silence or dismissed entirely. Outside, the lie continued. When the court finally announced the death on the 31st of January, the people were told of a peaceful passing. Bells rang across London. Black cloth was draped over shop windows. Priests gave sermons of dignity and providence. But none spoke of the burst coffin, of the dogs, of the rot that ran like blood through the palace stones, the man who had reshaped England, who had burned monks, destroyed queens. Rewritten, heaven had died, not as a saint or a sinner, but as a wound that could no longer be hidden. The funeral was set for the 16th of February. Until then, the king's body would lie in state, or rather, what remained of it. They placed a wax effigy of him atop the coffin, molded from older portraits. It showed a proud face, a strong chin, a ruler untouched by time, but those who looked at it closely noticed something strange. The eyes were too soft, the mouth too full, the hands too pale. It was not a king, it was a doll of a king. A story being rewritten in real time. In the days that followed, crowds gathered to see the cortege. Black-draped horses pulled the weight of that coffin through streets, washed in winter rain. Courtiers in mourning cloaks rode in silence. Priests sang the requiem, but the common people, those who had lived in fear of the man's voice, whose taxes had funded his wars, whose children had vanished into his jails, stood along the roadside, staring not at the coffin, but at the faces of those who followed it, watching who would mourn and who would move on. At Windsor Castle, in the stone heart of St. George's Chapel, the coffin was finally lowered into the vault. There, beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who had given him a son, and the only one who had died before she could disappoint him, Henry VIII was buried. The tomb was plain, the marble bare, the grand monument he had once designed, with 40 bronze statues and an equestrian colossus atop a golden dome, had never been built. The money had vanished. the artisans dismissed. And so, beneath the floor, he slept in silence. But the silence did not last. For months afterward, servants avoided the chamber. Some swore they heard groaning in the night. Some refused to enter at all. One boy claimed the floor grew warm beneath his feet when he passed over the vault. Another said the air near the tomb smelled like burned meat and wine. But none of them spoke aloud what they truly feared, that power, once decayed, does not die easily. It festers. It seeps. It waits. And in the coffin that had split under its own corruption, England had buried more than a king. It had buried a warning. They came for the body first, the embalmers, the priests, the physicians who had failed. Then came the scribes, to copy the will, and the lords, to carry the crown. But beneath the sweat-soaked sheets, behind the veils of incense and formality, after the limbs had stiffened and the organs had been taken and packed in perfumed cloth, there remained one thing untouched, one thing no one expected. A chest. Small. Plain. Unmarked. Locked. Hidden behind the king's bed. Covered in dust and shadows. Not guarded. Not catalogued. Not meant for anyone's eyes but his. It was found by accident. A servant, sweeping the floors on the morning after the coffin was taken, knocked his broom against the wooden panel. It echoed, hollow. He pulled it aside and saw the box cedarwood, iron braced, the kind used to hold private letters or relics of saints. There was no key, only a clasp wrapped in red ribbon, frayed with age. The servant did not open it. He summoned a secretary, who summoned a counselor, who sent for Thomas Cranmer himself. The archbishop arrived, still pale from administering final rites. And when they broke the seal, they found not gold, not rubies, not state secrets, but fragments. Soft, strange things, fragile and human. The first was a miniature portrait small enough to fit in a man's palm, painted on ivory. The face of Jane Seymour stared back, younger than in her final days. Her features soft, her eyes distant. It had been kissed, the paint smudged near the lips, as if touched too often, too long. Beneath it, wrapped in old cloth, was a single lock of hair, golden, graying at the edge, bound with a ribbon of Tudor green. Some said it belonged to his mother, Elizabeth of York. Others whispered it was from one of his daughters. No one could be sure. And beneath the hair, a prayer book child-sized. The leather cracked, the pages thumbed and stained. Inside, in a hand, small and deliberate, was a name: Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, the queen he had destroyed, the girl he had once declared illegitimate, the child who had grown up in silence, watching her father rule from a distance like a god. She had written inside the margins verses, hopes, her own name, drawn over and over in careful loops. No one knew how it had ended up here, inside the king's most private space. No one asked. These were not treasures. They were relics, not of royalty, but of regret. And in that chest, small enough to carry under an arm, lay the only proof that Henry VIII, beneath the crowns and furs and splintered bones, had carried something besides ambition in his final days. A tenderness he had never shown in life, or perhaps a guilt so heavy he could only bear it in silence. They did not speak of the box again. It was sealed, stored among the king's private effects, and buried beneath ledgers and inventory lists. History, too, would forget it, But for those few who opened it and saw what it held, there was no mistaking its message. The king had prepared everything else: the will, the funeral, the portraits, the tomb, 30 pages of succession, names carved in marble, titel passed like torch. He had arranged the future with iron precision, as if he could outwit death itself. But not this. Not that box. That was not a command. It was a confession. Even now, his will survives, ink on parchment, legal and cold. Edward would inherit first, then Mary, then Elizabeth. The line was clear, untouched by emotion, unmarred by contradiction. A perfect machine of monarchy. But the chest told another story. A story of a man who had made monsters of his doubts, who had loved and destroyed in equal measure, who had left behind not just a kingdom but memories that he had never dared speak aloud. And still, the court marched forward, while Seymour and the reformers gathered power in the name of a boy king, while Parliament prepared proclamations and ceremonies, while Jane Seymour's name was polished and Elizabeth's was whispered and Mary's was feared, the chest remained locked away. A ghost in wood and ribbon. No one used it. No one displayed it, but its contents lived in rumor, passed from chambermaid to clerk, from bishop to ambassador, each adding their own color to the tale. Some said the king had kissed that portrait every night. Others claimed he had wept over the prayer book when no one could see. Still others believed the chest was his last act of repentance, a private relic to a family he had torn apart with his own hands. Whatever the truth, the box did not lie. It had survived the rot, the smoke, the weight of the throne, and what it said was this: Henry VIII, even in death, remained a man of contradictions. A man who killed for love, who ruled through fear, who broke the church but feared the devil. A man who demanded legacy but dreamed of forgiveness. The coffin had burst. The body had leaked. The crown had passed. But in the small locked chest beneath the royal bed, sealed in silence and dust, England's most terrifying king left behind something no funeral could erase. A trace of the man he never let the world see. A wound too quiet for history. A truth too soft for his own voice. The body had cooled. The tomb had closed. The rot had been sealed behind stone and lead and silence. But in Whitehall and Westminster, the throne remained unoccupied. Untouchable. Too full of shadow to sit in just yet. Henry VIII was gone. But no one moved as though he were dead. Not truly. His shape still lingered in the halls. His weight still bowed the air, even in death. He ruled, not through command, but through memory, through fear, through ritual. England did not transition from one monarch to another. It staggered, like a child waking from a nightmare only to find it was real. Edward was 9 years old. He was small for his age. Pale. Sickly. His hands more familiar with ink than sword. His voice barely loud enough to carry across a chapel. But he was a king, or so the proclamations said. So the council declared. So the heralds shouted from the steps of St. Paul's, their breath turning white in the February air. And the people bowed. Not to him, but to the image of what he represented, the living proof that Henry's line had survived, that the fire had passed to another wick, that the sun, though dimmer, still burned. But Edward did not sit on the throne at first. Not fully. Not truly. In the great halls where his father had roared, the boy walked in silence. He was taught to pause before the empty seat, to lower his eyes, to acknowledge, without words, the presence of absence. They taught him to bow to his own future as if the throne were haunted, and perhaps it was. Edward Seymour, newly styled Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector, stood behind him, like a shadow cast in daylight. He spoke the words. He signed the edicts. He arranged the councils. But it was Edward's name that adorned every parchment. Edward's seal that marked every law. It was a rule without voice, without touch, without weight, a monarchy made of wax and mirrors, designed not to govern, but to preserve the illusion that Henry still ruled from beyond. The coronation was arranged with frantic precision. Every detail mattered. The boy's garments were tailored to resemble his father's same cut, same colors, same broad collar, stiff with embroidery. He was coached in posture, taught to stand wide-legged, like the Holbein portrait of Henry, the stance of certainty, of conquest. When he stepped before the people, they gasped, not because he was mighty, but because he was familiar. He had been sculpted into an echo. The throne itself had been polished until it gleamed like bone in moonlight. But no one had sat in it since the dead king last left it. Servants claimed it creaked at night, that the cushions still bore the dent of his weight, that moths refused to eat the cloth, that no dust settled on it, as if something unseen swept it clean every morning. So they let Edward stand beside it first, then near it, then behind it. Only when the crown touched his head did they let him lower himself into it. And even then, his legs dangled short above the step, his fingers gripping the arms, not in majesty, but in uncertainty. The nobles bowed, the bishops anointed. The crowd cheered, but in the silence that followed the music, in the long breath between ritual and rain, the people waited, not for Edward, but for Henry, for the man whose absence felt more present than the child who replaced him. The moment stretched, and then it passed. And still, the throne shivered. Cranmer preached a sermon declaring Edward the new Josiah, the godly boy king, who would purify England of idols and restore the true faith. But even he, the archbishop who had pressed Henry's dying hand for that final squeeze of salvation, flinched when he saw the boy's face. It was not conviction he saw there. It was strain, a kind of quiet drowning behind the eyes, as though the weight of the dead had already begun to press against the lungs of the living. In the days that followed, the court adjusted, slowly, uneasily. The paintings of Henry were not taken down, they were polished. His armor remained on display, cleaned daily. His seal remained beside Edward's, as if both hands still held the kingdom. Courtiers addressed the new king, but spoke in tones they had once used for his father. Every step forward was a step along Henry's shadow, and the child learned quickly. He learned not to speak too much, lest he contradict a ghost. He learned to sign what was placed before him, to smile at ambassadors, to ask questions that had already been answered in his stead. He was a figurehead atop a ship still steered by the crew his father had chosen. And every day, when he passed through the halls of Whitehall, he passed the door to the chamber where his father had died. It was locked now, sealed, but he knew. He never asked to go inside. Some said he dreamed of it, that he whispered in Latin in his sleep, that he sometimes sat up suddenly in the night and looked to the door, waiting for it to open. But nothing came through it. Only silence, and the sound of footsteps echoing in rooms where no one walked. The court whispered, as courts do, that the boy was clever, that he was obedient, that he was his father's son. But beneath the praise was an undercurrent of unease. Henry had been violent. Yes, but clear. Edward was quiet, blank, a mirror reflecting those who stood closest. And in that reflection, many saw not the future, but themselves. The throne had not been inherited. It had been hollowed, and into that hollow space, men pour ambition, doctrine, dreams. They spoke of reformation, of new orders, of purging the past. But the past was not gone. It lived in the wood grain of the throne, in the cold metal of the scepter, in the way the tapestries still told the story of a man who refused to die, even when his body had collapsed inward like a ruined temple. Edward wore the crown, but England still bowed to a ghost. There are certain rites no one dares skip when a king dies, not even when the king's flesh has already begun to betray the sanctity of ceremony, not even when his legs have rotted to the bone, and the very air around his body sours with each breath it no longer takes. Even then, especially then, the rituals must proceed, because in death, more than in life, monarchy is performance, and the audience is vast. The chamber had already been stripped of its softness. No silks remained on the windows. No cushions beside the bed. The thick velvet canopy had been taken down, bundled into carts, and carted away to be scoured. The sheets stained with blood, bile, and whatever final seepage had escaped, his husk of a body had been burned that first cold morning. In a quiet yard behind the kitchens, where even the laundresses would not go. But one garment had been kept, the final nightshirt, soaked through, crusted dark at the cuffs, shredded by frantic hands, trying to lift the dying king one last time. It had been folded, wrapped in oilcloth, and placed beneath the bed, as if no one dared deal with it yet. When Thomas Cranmer returned 2 days later to oversee the chamber's cleansing, he asked about the shirt. A servant pointed to the bed. The archbishop did not hesitate. He ordered it burned, not for sanitation, not for dignity, but for something deeper, to cauterize what remained, to rid the palace of residue, of memory. And so the shirt was placed in the brazier. It did not catch immediately. The cloth was too thick, too wet. It hissed. It spat. It smoked. But then, slowly, it curled into itself. Flames licked up its sides. The hem blackened. The stains boiled. And what had once clung to the king's skin disintegrated into nothing. This was the first ritual. Unspoken. Unzung. A funeral not for the man, but for the body that had contained him. What followed was more public, but no less false. The funeral was staged with all the opulence that the monarchy could afford, which, in truth, was less than anyone admitted. The treasury had been drained by wars, feasts, and the building of palaces that now stood half empty. But the people could not see that. They had to see splendor, majesté, finality. And so, black horses were draped in velvet, trumpets were shined, heralds were given new gloves, a wax effigy of the king, sculpted to resemble his prime, broad, fierce, eternal, was placed atop the coffin. No one would see the real body inside. No one would know that it had burst open days before, that it was packed with linen, resin, and rosemary to keep it from leaking again, that the coffin had already been patched once, and might split again if the roads shook too much. They carried it through London in silence. The people lined the streets, pressed shoulder to shoulder, their heads bowed, more in curiosity than grief. Few remembered what he had looked like in recent years. They remembered the portraits, the warlord stance, the glares, the wives, the rumors. And as the coffin passed, followed by lords in cloaks and banners heavy with lion and fleur-de-lis, they told each other stories. that he had killed his wives with his own hands, that his ghost had been seen walking in Hampton Court, that he had burned books and bishops and babies, that he had cried for his mother before he died. Everyone had a story. Few had the truth. At Windsor, the performance deepened. St. George's Chapel had been scrubbed, lit, perfumed. The floor beneath the altar had been opened. Jane Seymour already lay there, beneath stone and brass. And now, the king would join her, the one wife he had not tired of, the one who had given him a son and died before she could disappoint him. The coffin was lowered into the vault by 12 men, sweating under the weight. It did not lower easily. The ropes groaned. The lead creaked. But it reached the bottom, and there it stayed. The tomb unfinished. The grand monument never built. The bronze statues he had commissioned melted down for war. The equestrian statue of himself never cast. The legacy reduced to a sealed hole in the ground. And still, the rituals continued. The royal orb and scepter, the sword of state, the ceremonial gloves, all were displayed, then packed away. The funeral book recorded every step, every word. But the book did not note the tremble in the priest's voice, nor the way one of the coffin bearers wept silently when they turned to leave. Not from sorrow, but from something deeper, relief, perhaps, or fear, or the sudden realization that power, when stripped of pageantry, smells like rot and wax and old iron. Outside the chapel, the wind picked up. Snow had begun to fall again. Light, thin flakes that stuck to velvet and lace. The horses stamped. The crowd dispersed. The chapel doors closed. Inside, beneath slabs of stone, the king lay. No monument would rise above him. No chant would echo his name into eternity. But in the silence that followed his burial, England exhaled, not because he had ruled, but because he was finally gone. They said he ruled like a god. They said he broke empires with the tilt of his head, rewrote heaven with ink and iron, and made even the Pope blink. They said he commanded the skies and the seas, and that no one, not a queen, not a bishop, not a foreign prince could stand before his anger and not tremble. But the last truth of Henry VIII was this: he died alone. Not ceremonially, not metaphorically, but utterly, physically, spiritually alone. And in that silence, not the majestic silence of cathedral bells or bowed heads, but the small, gnawing silence that seeps into a room after the final breath, the truth of his life finally emerged. There had been people in the room. Yes, priests, physicians, a few hand-picked men sworn to secrecy, but none of them were family. Not Edward, the boy king who barely knew him. Not Mary, the daughter he had once banished. Not Elizabeth, the girl whose mother he beheaded. Not even Catherine Parr, the wife who had tried to be a balm, but was now kept at a distance by courtiers more interested in inheritance than grief. He had reigned over millions. He had feasted in candlelit halls while the poor starved outside. He had commanded fleets and armies. And yet, at the end, there was no one left to hold his hand except the archbishop, who asked him gently to squeeze once if he still believed. He did. He squeezed. Or so the record says. That gesture small, half-formed, uncertain became the myth that followed. A deathbed redemption. A final moment of clarity. Protestant reformers held it up as proof that the king had died in their faith. Catholics dismissed it as fantasy, pointing to the masses he had ordered just weeks before. But the truth, like so many truths about Henry, did not belong to either side. It lived in the ambiguity, in the trembling of that single hand, in the way no one could quite agree if the pressure had come from muscle or reflex. And what of the kingdom he left behind? The will was clear. 30 pages of names and lines of succession. Edward first, then Mary, then Elizabeth. A vision of dynastic order as precise and unyielding as the iron gates of the tower. But within days, the plan began to unravel. Edward Seymour-sized power. Not as one of 16 equals in a regency council, but as Lord Protector. He moved fast, quiet, deadly. Rivals were exiled, executed, or silenced. The boy king was crowned. Yes, but his signature was guided. His throne surrounded. His words filtered through other mouths. And Henry's body, once wrapped in majesty, became just another task to manage. The funeral procession faded into the mud of February. The mourning cloaks were folded and packed. The effigy was stored in an attic. The vault at Windsor was sealed with stone, and the men who had served him some for decades found themselves cast into the cold. The keeper of his dogs dismissed. The man who warmed his sheets gone without pension. The court moved on, because it had to. But some did not. Some could not. There are letters, preserved in quiet archives, written by former chamberlains, cooks, physicians, men who had once knelt beside the royal bed. They write of confusion, of loss, of purpose suddenly gone. One took his own life. Unable to find a place in the new world of boyish grace and Protestant zeal. Another wandered Europe, telling stories of the king's last hours to anyone who would buy him a drink. A third disappeared entirely. And what of the people? The subjects, who had known only Henry all their lives. They dreamed. Parish records show a strange increase in reports of omens, burning trees, bleeding bread, stars seen in daylight. Children claimed to see the king in windows. Old women heard his voice in wells. Ghost stories. Perhaps. Or something older. The fear that when a giant dies, the earth itself tilts. They had lived under his shadow for nearly 4 decades. Now they lived in the echo. But echoes fade. And time is not kind to men like Henry. The body bloated, burst, and buried. The statue never built. The crown passed. The throne warmed by other hands. The sons of his enemies became the counselors of his children. The pope who excommunicated him died. The reforms he began became revolutions he never wanted. The church he created changed its own name. Even the face that once stared down Europe, the hands on hips glare of Hans Holbein's portrait became something for textbooks and souvenirs. Its menace dulled by repetition. And yet, there is still something there. In the stone of Windsor, in the page of the will, in the smell that never quite left the bedchamber, in the chest they found behind the bed, in the hair, the miniature portrait, the child's prayer book, the name Elizabeth written in loops and flourishes. In those things, perhaps, lies the last piece of him. Not the tyrant, not the God-king, but the man, the father, the body that failed, the mind that fractured, the hand that reached for forgiveness in the dark. No title followed him. No crown went with him. No sword could cut the rot. And when he stood, if he stood before whatever waited beyond, there was no ceremony, no heralds, no bells, no throne, only the man, alone, as all kings are. In the end,